Good morning, everybody, all participants of our webinar for the Practice the PNAC Practice Community for supporting the adaptation, climate change adaptation plans for climate change. Today's will be about gender approach and indigenous communities in planning for adaptation and articulation with the NAPs. Thank you for your participation. My name is Lieva from Practical Action, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's webinar. First, I would like to ask you if you can hear me well. Please write so on the chat to the right hand corner. Having said that, I would like to give you some technical specifications on the VoiceBoxer platform. Webinars presentations can be listened to in English and in Spanish with simultaneous interpretation. You can choose your language with the bottom right hand corner of your screen where it says choose your language. If you have any questions with the audio or other types of problems with the platform, please do refresh the platform, or maybe you can click on the question mark for technical support. That question mark is located on the bottom left hand corner of the screen. We will share these slides and the recording with all participants. If you can't see very well the presentations or the slides, you can zoom out on the browser. Having said that, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you all on behalf of PNAC. This community's initiative of UN Environment through the Regatta project, and is implemented in collaboration with Practical Action. Its main objective is to support public officers, researchers, and other professionals in elaborating the national adaptation plans on climate change in the Latin America region and the Caribbean. The PNAC is a quite important opportunity for adopting a comprehensive approach that addresses issues like vulnerability, difference between women and men, and their strength on the adaptation capacities. We will here present new ideas on this perspective on gender approach and different types of approaches from indigenous people on implementing and the national adaptation plans. Let's try to answer these two questions. What is the importance of adopting an approach, a gender approach for planification of climate change? And what is the process to do so? What are the main benefits and challenges in order to integrate considerations of indigenous communities in the planification and implementation of NAPs? In order to try to answer those two questions, we invited two speakers from different countries. We invited Isabelle Martinez, officers of the Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean, UN Environment; Victor Sang, officers of the program of the Gender Unit of UN Environment from Nairobi; and Gilma Roman, coordinator of the 5th Summit of Local Governments and Authorities for the Organization of Public People in the Colombian Amazon zone. After the presentations, we will have a question and answer session, and that is where we will answer your questions. For answering you, I will wait for that period of time for the speakers to answer your questions. It is a pleasure to introduce our first speaker and welcome Isabelle Martinez from Panama. She's a lawyer by the Universidad Católica from Venezuela with studies of master in England and Spain in environmental law. From 1995, her professional activity has been linked to the UN program, UN Environment, by coordinating the development and execution of programs and projects at the global level and in Latin America and the Caribbean, related basically to comprehensive management of water resources. I believe you cannot hear me very well. Can you hear me well? Please write so on the chat. Okay, let's continue. From 2012, Isabelle also coordinated the training network for Latin America and the Caribbean for UN Environment, and from 2017 she is the focal point on gender approach for Latin America and the Caribbean. Having said that, I give the floor to Isabelle. Thank you, Isabelle. Thank you, Lily. Can you hear me? Can you write so on the chat? Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Lily, for the presentation, and Climate Change in the Office for the opportunity to participate in this practice community that has been working for such a long time. Just to start this gender approach and indigenous communities in planning for adaptation and its articulation with the NAPs, I will center in a couple of things. First, we will highlight the social reference of climate change, the effects that are quite unknown and sometimes quite difficult to consider, even more than climate change. Climate change, we know it, we know all the effects in infrastructure, economy, in all social issues. Gender approach and the situation of the indigenous communities has been left behind. They are quite vulnerable. The second aspect is the planification for adaptation to climate change. From its contributions to sustainable development, that also has some similar considerations: water resource management, coastal zone management, etc. And I will also give you some examples, since this is a practical project and new policy on countries in the region. They are trying to incorporate the gender approach and to make the indigenous community most visible. And at the end, we finish with some things in order to talk about on the chat. As for how social aspects of climate change are not addressed and are less known on planification issues, they happen basically in the UN framework and the recent analysis through the expert panel of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that there is a recognition that climate change have different impacts on women and men, and that their effects tend to highlight social inequality, social difference, and especially in many cases, but I think my colleague Victor will address on this, the gender approach and women are not synonyms. Even when we talk about gender approach and how this affects women, that actually it's a relation between men and women that generates a situation. Climate change also affects education and rural zones like indigenous communities or African descendant population due to the dependence of natural resources and support on the environment they live at, and due to consideration of marginalization where they are found, and due to the access to different resources. That is why we say what I mentioned at the first slide, that climate change is not neutral for gender approach or the situation of indigenous communities, and that we know that thanks to our work done in Nicaragua, thanks to the PNUD and another local or NGO and a person that with a student with a simulation of systems in Nicaragua. The second point that I wanted to mention is planning for adaptation to climate change, which is a process for sustainable development, and that has quite similarities to a longer process. The management of water resources, the process of adaptation based on ecosystems, planification processes for the coastal zone, and in that planning cycle, from the point of view of common aspects, they go through the initial diagnosis, design of programs, through processes that should be participatory from communities, since they will benefit from those programs for the film to implementation and its adoption. Those are topics that were already known, that this planification process benefited men and women equally, but the process as for indigenous communities were left aside for this due to rural reasons, due to language or superiority of scientific knowledge, or due to geographic situation. So when we talk about the planning process for adaptation to climate change, we need to say that we have some reference that in this process, that it is a process that was not so as successful as it should have been in terms of incorporating the gender approach and vulnerable communities. So how to overcome this, how to improve this? There is not a recipe for success. It would depend on each country, on each community, but part of the process goes through by asking many questions on the context based on the results that are expected, and some questions that may ease that process in order to planify and incorporate in the gender approach is why some regions and social groups are more affected than others, the institutional limitations for adaptation, and that leads to that planification or the measures that are taken are quite divided into groups. The measures that try to incorporate this aspect cross-cutting way, in some others with definitely. We will talk about a policy in Chile, and we will see how they mix together. As for Latin America event, we deal with the at different levels. In Panama, in between 28 and 2012, based on the fund for the World Development Goals financed by the government of Spain, we did some joint programs at the country level at different branches. In the case of Panama, in that window, we had 4 government agencies in order to formulate a joint program, or try measures for adaptation mitigation in 2 basins in Spain. During the project, there was a design and conception of different measures that were discussed and that were generated after the interaction with people in both basins. One of them, the Chucunac Basin, located in the Dayac region with the indigenous community in Vera, and that was directed in order to improve the production fields of the chunga plant used for textiles and baskets made by women of the community, but it was also used as construction material. So the issue with climate change there is that there were a lot of flooding in the area, especially where the plant grew. So thanks to that program and thanks to one of the measures of the living conditions, economic conditions from men and women of the region, we established a program where there was a difference. We looked for replant some areas, identifying the most correct areas in order to do so, but also to make sure that those new zones and production could benefit men and women who used the plant for production or construction. There's a video that I sent it quite late for the organizers, that we cannot share this with you, but you will have it in the final material with the presentations, the final presentation that we will show afterwards. So that is one of the examples of the program where we have a qualified teams with these measures of climate change, adaptation to climate change, in order to improve production of a plant for men and for women. And my last point, as for policies, I would like to say that in Chile we tested the action plan for climate change for 2017-2028. So here we included as one of the main guides the equity principle, considering that measures for climate change need to be beneficial for all, and especially in communities, and specifically the principle says that we need to consider it very well the gender, human resources, and different other things. And I wanted to highlight 2 things. These measures are organized by sheets, the objectives, the descriptions, the indicators, etc. One of the measures is linked with adaptation that has to do with evaluating the risk of natural and human systems face the impacts of climate change for them to be incorporated in the planification. So that is a cross-cutting approach, but at the same time the same thing has measures in the implementation measures, with a sheet trying to address integration and gender approach and social cultural approach in climate change. In the description of that sheet, we mentioned the recognition of men and women regarding the response capacity for climate change to incorporate this concept in politics of climate change. As an indicator has to have a guide for gender approach and aspect social cultural approach in different plans for adaptation and mitigation for climate change. In the case of Peru in 2016, the action plan for gender and climate change was approved. Here is we call it an approach, in the cultural approach, and again I will read recognition of climate change, trying to look for a relationship in a different and specific space, physical space, and assimilate as own the different conceptions of benefit and development. In this case, the action plan of Peru has 8 years: forests, water resources, food security, waste management, and for each area they relate the gaps related to gender and a matrix with strategic objectives and results. So I invite you to read these documents that are located on the website. They were indicated in the final documents of the webinar. And to finish, I'll leave you with this. One, that in understanding the climate change and human relations, how they affect men and women, it's quite limited. We need to create a context to analyze it, and in each locality, in each space, how to address these issues effectively in the national adaptation plans. Climate change, it is also needs to be in a context, and basically there is no unique formula of how to do it. And finally, that is important, the indigenous communities' voices, men and women, for the planification process, and other vulnerable communities, as I mentioned before, since they were subject to different processes for imagination. And in the case of women, they cannot participate as active as they would want to do so in the government institutions. Due to discrimination and due to problems with their capacities. With that, I finish my presentation. Sorry for the inconvenience, sorry for taking too long. Thank you very much for this introduction. As for the importance of incorporating gender approaches and implementing adaptation measures, as well as giving some examples of Panama and Chile and how they was addressing different policies for climate change. I give the floor to Victor Sen from Nairobi. Currently, Victor is official on gender approach on United Nations, UN Environment. And he had also the same position in Rome, in Italy. Victor has worked in order to strengthen the gender and different policies from Ethiopia to Panama, from Sudan to Chad to Japan to France, in order to develop the capacity for the indicators and create gender evaluations. It is a pleasure for me to talk with Hector, who will share some ideas on the model of climate change using forms. Thank you very much, Victor, for your participation. Here you have the floor.
First of all, can you hear me well? If you can't hear me well, could you please type in the chat box so that I know I can continue. Great. So before I start, there are 3 things I want to say. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. First of all, I'm now actually at home, in my home in Nairobi, Kenya. So don't be surprised if you hear some background noise. Second, I want to recognize some of my colleagues who joined, show their support to me for this webinar. And even to my surprise, I want to say I have one colleague from our Osaka, Japan office, and it's actually now midnight in Japan. And I'm so touched by the support of my colleague. And somehow I think to do gender work, sometimes when we do the planning, a lot of theory of change, logical framework, but it's actually the passion, the obsession for gender equality and social justice, like my colleagues are demonstrating, that are really making a difference. So I want to say thank you to the colleagues who support me to join this webinar. And the third thing I want to say is that for this presentation, I'm going to leave more questions than answer. So I'm not going to say everything. Rather, I want to leave some question for you to think, because I think we need more inspiration than information. But of course, if you have questions, we can discuss at the end. So with that, I'm going to start my presentation. Shaping climate change adaptation with shapes. Shapes, I mean like circles, square, and triangle. So first slide, I want you to think yourself. When we talk about gender, what comes to your mind? Is it about access to resources, or sexual violence, reproduction, or maybe the recent Me Too campaign? What comes to your mind when we talk about gender? And what I want to say is that a lot of the time, a lot of our actions, our focus and our conversations, we focus on addressing women's vulnerabilities. Because we know that environmental changes, they have different impact on women and men, and usually the focus is on the vulnerability of women, which is very true. But then this is only one side of the coin, because when we talk about, just like my colleague Isabelle was saying, we need to think about both sides, women and men. When we say, for example, women have little access to natural resources, have little control over income, and they bear the bulk of the burden of climate change, we are actually also talking about the privileges of men. That's what I call the inconvenient truth that usually we do not talk about. But if we are to achieve equality, we need to address the other side as well. And so far, we talk about women's vulnerability and men's privileges. This is only a small part of what I want to talk about on gender. So you may not be able to see all the 4 squares in this screen. I'm not sure if you can see all the 4 squares. So what the 4 squares are showing is actually that we are saying women's vulnerability, men's privileges, but also we can talk about the other side, men's vulnerability and women's advantages. And this, again, I will leave the question to you because different people may have different perspective and different experience. So can men be really vulnerable? Can women be powerful? Are we distorting the reality? Or is it something that we need to pay attention to? So this I call the gender quest or the holistic gender framework. So this question, I'll leave it to you. So let's continue. So even when we talk about the false quest, we talk about women's and men's advantages and disadvantages. We are only talking about a small part of the whole gender discussion, what I call the gender circle. Because we also need to talk about, for example, gender issues beyond women and men, for example, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex issues. And we need to talk about masculinity and femininity. And we also don't forget about the laws, the cultures, the policies, and the religions that either facilitate or hinder gender equality. And when we talk about the squares and now the gender circle, and now we need to come to other circles because we are talking about also on social inclusion. There are different kinds of vulnerability. Some people may be from lower income background or from lower social class. So we need to think about social inclusion, gender, and then of course our main topic on climate change adaptation. So you may have learned about this Venn diagram in your mathematics lesson when you are in school. So we need to think about what is the overlapping area of gender, social inclusion, and adaptation. So that could be our focus. And as I say, I don't want to confuse you, but when we talk about social inclusion, there are also four squares we can talk about. We talk about the included, the excluded. And what do we mean by this is that it's more by the criteria, how they are born to be. It's not so easy to change. For example, you may have heard about in South Asia, they have the caste system, the caste. So when you are born, you either belong to a high caste or a low caste. So, and then that will determine whether you are included or excluded. It may also be the case of, for example, in Europe or in the US, whether you are black or white. That's basically also determine whether you will be included or excluded in many situations. But then inclusion, we also talk about vulnerability. For example, based on a particular circumstance, for example, after a flood, after a typhoon, after an earthquake, or maybe in a particular situation that some people will become vulnerable, but they are not forever vulnerable. It's only a particular situation that can change. So when we are doing our climate change adaptation planning, we need to think about who are the people who are included or excluded, who are the people who are vulnerable or non-vulnerable. Okay, so now we are coming to the solution. So we started at talking about women's vulnerabilities. So it's only one small part, or we can call it the tip of the iceberg. And then we come to talk about the four squares, women and men's advantages and disadvantages. And then we come to talk about the bigger gender circle that also includes issues like masculinity, femininity, and the culture, the law, the policy that may promote or may hinder gender equality. And then we come to the three circles of gender, social inclusion, and climate change adaptation. So now we are here. We want to promote equality when we do or adaptation planning. So we are using this triangle to illustrate our solution. So first of all, these are the core inputs, what I call. Usually we focus here that when you do your project planning, you may think that you need to do a gender or social analysis. You may want to do a vulnerability assessment. You may do your proper stakeholder engagement, including civil society or different groups. And you may think that we need to do training or build capacity for government or for NGO on gender issues. Sometimes we may hire experts to do the gender or social inclusion work. So these are usually what we do when we do the project planning in our log frame, in our theory of change. These are the inputs into the project. So, but there's also something what I call, so these are the some of my personal example. For example, I was in Laos last year in Southeast Asia. So I supported some of the work on community engagement, talking to women and men in community, looking at what are their roles, what do they do. Sorry, let's go back. And also talking to some women's agency in the government. So as you can see, for example, in the picture, this could be stereotype, but as you can see, women are taking care of children, and then the men are having fun playing their ball games. So, but in different country and in different community, this can be different. So that's why we need to do our analysis. And then it comes to the special inputs, because sometimes when we do our proper planning, it may not succeed because we may forget about like something even more important. As I started this webinar, I talk about passion and obsession. Sometimes when you think about great people making a difference, it's actually that obsession or that I call emotional intelligence or positive thinking, or being flexible and understanding and being patient. This kind of soft skill that may help us make a difference. So although we will probably not include this in your project document, you won't include this in your log frame, but you shouldn't forget about this when you do the think about how to advance gender and social inclusion in your project. Okay, so now we move to the next step. So far we are on step 1, on the lower left-hand side of the triangle. So on step 2, as you can see, we need to think about our output, or maybe our results and indicators. What do we want to achieve? So for example, you may think about you want to check number of women and number of men in our activities, either in the consultation or maybe they're participating in the workshop or even attending the climate change conference, the COP. And then you may think about we may need to include gender and social inclusion in capacity building in our workshop. For example, so when we are training government or civil society people on how to do adaptation planning, then we need to add some topic on talking about climate change impact on women and men and how we can apply different adaptation strategies for women and men. And also budget allocation. So the results can be a national adaptation plan document with budget allocation and gender analysis. So results can be at different level. It can be about number of women and men. It can be about a document that we are producing, a policy document. So these are the things usually we will include in our planning, in our theory of change and in our log frame. So these are some of my example when I did training, for example, capacity building for people in different countries. And also when I travel to communities, looking at the roles of women and men. So just to demonstrate to you what we can do. So, and then we come to the special output for step 2. So these are probably things that we won't include in our project document. But then don't forget, for example, we need to also promote government ownership and their plight. And we need people to feel engaged. And so in the case of the United Nations, it means that, for example, we shouldn't do everything ourselves. We should let the national government and national stakeholder to be in the driver's seat. They should lead the process. And then and also about gender equality and social inclusion work, we should have people feel that this is part of their culture, part of their work, not something imposed by the UN or by the donors. And also special outputs, and we should also think about how we can increase the knowledge of the stakeholder, because if in one activity we can build their capacity and their interest on gender equality and social inclusion, they can do that in other areas, maybe in their project on biodiversity or in their project on other environmental issues. Then they will also apply their knowledge on gender equality and social inclusion. So it's important also the process we need to build that capacity. So that's why I say when we plan for what we want to achieve, we also need to think about this softer side of result. Okay, so the last step on is what I call to make success for everyone, because not sure if you agree or not. I will say that everyone, we are all selfish. We probably think about our own interest than anything else. So when we promote gender equality and social inclusion, we also need to think about how we can create success for different groups of people. If you are working in the Ministry of Environment, if you are working in the UN, if you are working in a NGO, how you can create success for yourself when you do work on gender equality and social inclusion. I would say that only when we align personal success or maybe the success for your organization with the interest of gender equality and social inclusion, that there's a higher chance of success. So don't forget about this one when you do the adaptation planning. Okay, so yeah, just to repeat a little bit and what we mean by this super triangle. It's actually a simple planning tool. On the bottom left is about input to something. If you want to promote gender equality in this case, so what are the inputs you need to think about, and what are the outputs or the results on the bottom right? And on top is something about values. And in this case, I will say how to create success for everyone. And in order to recapture our learning on this triangle, and then I've created a 1-minute video on YouTube. So you can click on the link here, so we can watch the video together before we end this presentation. So if possible, you can click on the link, and then we'll spend a minute for all of you to watch the video on YouTube. So I'm also going to play it here in my computer. So let me know if anyone has problem in opening the link, but I guess it should be straightforward. Great. So I guess most of you have a chance to view the video. So feel free to do so to watch the video again after the whole webinar. I think this will be a useful way because gender equality is an old business. We have started the movement, I think, back in many years ago, but then we need new ideas, new way to present it, to draw people's interest, to make it something that attractive, something that people will find it trendy and useful, and to broaden the audience to people who are not traditionally gender professional. People may be coming from science background or economics background. So that's my inspiration of why I want to use shapes to promote gender equality and social inclusion. So I'm going to stop here, and if there are any questions, we can discuss later. And on the last slide, you will also have my contact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor, for sharing this presentation and this tool, the new ideas how to address this topic so complex with integration on gender focus and perspective on gender in planning for adaptation for climate change. Thank you for this new vision for thinking out of the box and in order to see how we can implement these ideas presented by you. Having said that, I would like to give the floor to our third presenter, Gilma Roman from Colombia. She is a coordinator of the 5th Summit of Communities of Colombian Amazon with support from the United Nations, and she will give a presentation of an example of the approaches and qualifications on things regarding climate change, decision making and planning in Colombia. Thank you very much, Gilma, and you have the floor. Thank you very much. I will speak in my language. My name is Gilma Roman. I am an indigenous from the Matoto people, and I have the process of indigenous women here in Colombia, which is the organization of the Colombian organization and indigenous women in climate change. To talk about gender, we see that it's not a category within the language that we have for indigenous people, but it is a tool that helps us in the reality that we have as women. I will mention the talk about the political part, and we'll end up by the message of our message of us as indigenous women. LOPIA is our organization, national organization of the indigenous people of the Colombian Amazonian, that talks with the Colombian state in different spaces for fighting the individual rights, collective rights of indigenous people of the 56 indigenous communities of the Colombian Amazon, including the 18 indigenous people that have contact or that do not have existence in the jungle, or the indigenous people in the voluntaries, in order to understand well the Inter-American Court. LAMIAC is a space for fighting indigenous people. We did a course for advocacy on indigenous people, since there were some processes that were affecting indigenous people, in armed conflict. That is why we ask for the intervention of specific people. Since women were the most affected by this, not to say that men are not affected, but women are the most affected due to the situation they live at during the armed conflict. So before they met, we had a decree that had to do with the regional roundtable, Amazon regional roundtable, with a technical. And our fight for us women was that in those spaces, in decision-making spaces, women should take part of this, because indigenous people, our experience is that we do the daily task. We do not want to go against the rights that we have for women, but we want to achieve balance according to the principles and the culture that we have, how we contributed not only for our life, our responsibilities that we had, but in decision making we should also contribute in this, and how climate change also affects women, us as women. So this space for us is quite important. We address the Amazonian space, but I believe last year we were able to talk with Ministry of Environment, and on this working table on this working table where there were different situations, the government and different other organizations, in this space we were able to achieve some sort of attention from different institutions. As for rivers, as for reed, indigenous Amazon reed, this is a space that is born from the 9 countries of the Amazonian basin in order to talk about political issues about different topics, important topics at national level. RED is a contribution of all people that is born in order to fight greenhouses effects on different situations. In the case of Colombia, we have a local process that happens in the Putumayo field, which is the Chile Amazonas. It's some sort of like a process that we have, but actually the message is to preserve the cultural principles. The longer we could perceive them, the more we can contribute to the processes that we have for mitigation and adaptation, since we all have managed the territory. It's not that we have always we preserved it, we also changed it, we made some modifications. So when these principles are lost, or when they go into different lands that we know of, armed conflict, illegal mining, where there are some spaces that are not from us, that the cultural principles that we have as women and men is lost. So we don't see it as different. So what we see normally is that women, we contribute greatly and this contribution needs to be shared with all the problems that we have, since we are the ones that give the knowledge. We need to achieve the balance of men and women. In our case, from the Witoto people, when we are going to make some changes to the field, it is actually the women that sees the land, seeds, and even how it is going to be replaced. Women, we take all knowledge of our plants. For example, for you to understand in our cosmovision as women. So an example, if for example we're going to do a field, we're going to seed chontadura, which is a plant. We cut that chontadura since it's a forest. We find coca, bejuco, etc., and all that, we replace that. We will replace the plants, whether for eating and for the cultural things. So we would like to see how that culture is being fight, since there is a fight, since we find many things that I believe since there's a lot of things that we face, that there will be even a greater problem, climate change, that we are facing. So in the positive aspect, when we consider there need to be some public policies that generally, then in those public policies, women should be more participants internationally, since there's a lack of this. So we started with different programs in order to strengthen some processes to strengthen. So right now, the Amazonian community, we will say that is going through. There is no respect. We do not respect the things that ecological calendar, which is quite important for us, since it's a territory management that says when we should cut, when there are diseases, when there are different, the role of women, the men, etc. So that ecological calendar that we have in indigenous people is quite important, and that is being lost, and that is important to contribute for this, since we are working on this issue. I asked, can you hear me well? Because I started talking and I thought you were listening to me. For me, this is quite important, since I would say the ecological calendar would be like the contribution that we have as indigenous people, since it has to do with the territory management, not only the ecological calendar. It's not that we see the calendar, but with this climate change, it affects this calendar. Before, we had seeing the different types of times in the life. For Christmas, as for women, as I mentioned, there should be a greater participation, not only to see it as only an activity, but there should be there's a fight there's a fight in us that, for example, when we go in the interior of the cosmovision, women were never vulnerable or discriminated. We see that there are some actions that were taken in the history, for example, evangelization, etc. As different things that we live, there were some roles that were adopted that we could say that they are that affect our rights. So when you actually see the role of our men and women, all this in our case, an authority or a cacique cannot be a cacique if that is not the case. We see that women represents many things. We see that all education and training have been lost, and we should improve and work different policies in order to respect our different things. So that would be my presentation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate. Thank you very much, Gilma, for giving us this perspective. Thank you for your experience on indigenous women, and for giving us more information as to what is important to have into account when we try to incorporate these elements. As for indigenous people, for adaptation and development of climate change. Thank you very much. And for your participation. I think we can close and finish presentations. Thank you very much for all participants. Isabelle, Victor, Gilma, for your excellent presentations on integrational gender approach in indigenous people and planification for climate change. So we now have an open question and answer session. I will thank all participants to ask your questions on the chat. There's a version for you to add your question in Spanish and English. So now I have received some questions, and I will start with 2 questions for Isabelle while we wait for the questions. I have 2 questions. First question will come from Joel Perez. From your experience, is there any learned lessons as to how to increase or maintain the interest of national entities on gender approach and adaptation to climate change? And the second question for Isabelle comes from Alba Milena Ruiz. What is your position faced to the options to develop a action plan specific for gender and climate change? Again, including the gender approach, cross-cutting in the planning and management of climate change without considering specific action plan for that. So with those specific questions, I will give the floor to Isabelle while we wait for other questions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the questions. We're going to keep the interest of national entities. I think that is quite important is to systematize the information. Have a solid base with the result that we have. I gave an example of Panama with some quite important, that it was important for the community. As far as I know, those experiences were transferred to the planification process that were quite extensive. So lessons learned are to inform data, examine data, and to transfer them to these entities to show how those aspects are achievable. As mentioned by Victor, for social inclusion, that has to do with national policies. And my preference, my vision on for including this concurrent way, we'll say both, and that is the example of Chile. What I can know about the topic, the better. The more I can know about the topic, the better. There are some advantages and disadvantages. For obtaining having a specific plan, we need an expertise. It's important, but once it is created, it has to be the capacity to work in different processes. If we do it cross-cuttingly, coordinators for the plans need to try to achieve to have this capacity within. I believe that we need to try to see it in different ways, cross-cuttingly and with own initiative. I don't know if I answered the question. Thank you very much, Isabelle, for answering the questions. If there are any questions, you can write them on the chat. Well, we received 2 questions also for Victor. I will read them. The first question comes from John Perez. If there is a case where there's an explanation for the super triangle in terms of social inclusion, what are the most common barriers and more important that you faced? The second question is are there any examples of the specific activities of the projects that could see the different specific interests of the state of step 2 of the triangular process? If there's an example for that of the country, it would be quite helpful. Thank you, Victor. You have the floor.
So I can quote a dilemma rather than a success story. It's actually not always so straightforward. For example, last week I was in Nepal in South Asia, helping a project on urban adaptation. So the dilemma was that we tried to make sure that the government was in the driver's seat, the government was in control, but then we have the other side of, what I call the dilemma. The other side, we want to promote gender equality and social inclusion. So by putting the government in charge of everything, it means that we are not telling them what to do. We are not saying that you should do this, you should do that, because we need to give the power to them. We need to trust them. They should be the one who tell us what to do. They're in charge. So the dilemma is that the government has limited awareness on gender issue. And so at the end, for example, in the stakeholder workshop, so most of the participants are men, and most of them are from government. There are very limited representation from civil society, not to mention organizations that can represent the interests of women or men. So that's why I say we need to consider that what I put in the super triangle as the special output. We need to consider these things, but in reality, it could be a dilemma. It could be not so straightforward that we achieve promote government ownership at the same time, but also we promote gender equality and social inclusion. It's usually not something that they are familiar with. So yeah, maybe let me stop here. And if there are any other specific question, maybe I can follow up by email with those who ask the questions.
This is for Gilman. This comes from René Velasquez. First, what is the ecological schedule? When you mentioned it in your presentation, and the second question is, how are you solving the pesticide issue? Ilma, you have the floor. Thank you very much for your answer. Thank you. As for the ecological calendar, is like for the center word is, let's say, like not a regular calendar by month, but it shows a relation between nature, land, and man, in this case community. To give you an example, according to the ecological calendar, on this month, February, for us, it would be the end of the year. This is when we are able to cut our land. That is called the chagras. According to our way of thinking, it's time for us women to see the land where we can change for our food, collect for our food. So we should be doing this, the cutting of the trees. And now then we have March. It has to do with the seeding, and not only with deforestation and replacing, but it is related to diseases, so it is a control. There is a control. They will have municipal plans for controlling, for not polluting, not to use those pesticides. But throughout the plans and according to calendar, we would say that it is time to collect. Maybe I talked a little bit too much on this, but that is because I think that is quite important for us. For us as an indigenous country, I wouldn't be able to talk at a national level. There are 102 people out of the 66. I would be talking about the cosmovision of 6 people. 6 people. We call it the central people, which is the Bora people, Piraña Ukaina, Umuina, and Doke, that we have a cultural affinity relation, and that is how we relate to other people, respecting how they manage everything, the territory. But everything is there. My greatest concern right now is that the seed and all this contribution that could be given are being lost. We are losing a lot of medicinal plants, seeds for territorial control that is quite useful for us, not only for indigenous people, but for human beings that we live here. It's quite important. So my greatest concern right now is that many of these practices have been lost. That is my greatest concern. If we keep doing that, we don't do that, there would be great cuttings for cattle, for different industries. Right now, we have a relationship with the Western world, but we request for respect of this culture, since the indigenous people are the guardians of the forest, and are the guardians of the forest. There are people that they maintaining the planet. I don't know if that is, if you understood my answer, because and I know it's quite difficult to know the Western world of our cosmovision. I know it is quite complex. Thank you very much, Gilma, for trying to respond and explain this complex topic. Last question, some more minutes. The question is for Gilma. The loss of these cultural practices, what is it based on? Is it due to external influence or other factors? Gilma, you have the floor again. The loss of these cultural practices, it was the framework of the armed conflict where we lost our territories, and the other things would be the policies when they enter the territories, when there is armed conflict or drug trafficking. There are cultural practices that do not belong to us. In our territories there is not very presence of the state in order to access health and education. Young people or us, not so young, we do not want to follow those teachings. So we prefer, in a way, other cultures. So armed conflict breaks the social tissue, breaks all roles. Women are the most affected. And as I explained on the presentation, there is a historical process that led us to live in the land. Those are cultural losses and practices. It is a reality. We see that people is more concentrated in cities, big cities, and territories, in the case of Colombian Amazonian, is being left alone. And consider historic, in our case, the indigenous people, and we're not a people, there is not much of 30 families, because of Witoto, we are 56 people, but 56 towns, but there is not many places there. So territories are being left. People are coming to the cities, especially Bogota, since Bogota has a public policy, and people see it like a benefit in benefiting and exceeding those benefits, and our territories and preservation, etc. is quite worrying for humanity. Thank you very much, Hilma, for sharing the situation with us and the loss of this type of practices on this. If there are any other questions that we were not able to answer, you can write them and share we can share also the context of the speakers for them to answer those questions. And with that, we close the question and answer session. With that webinar, we learned that there is progress on how to include aspects and perspective of gender and indigenous people in planning and planification of adaptation for climate change. We also heard some experiences in Latin America and in Asia. We need to see what are the specific differences between men and women and how to address those differences effectively in an adaptation plan, since there is not a formula. We have to learn of a specific context. It is important the voice of men and women in order to learn their worries, as Gilma mentioned, and in order to try to rescue all practices that are quite important for expressing adaptation to climate change and to attack different type of threats. As Victor mentioned, we have to think out of the box. How to include social inclusion approaches also in planning. So thank you very much to all three participants, Victor, Sang, Gilma, and Isabelle, and I thank all participants for your attendance, so active participation in the question and answer session. It has been a pleasure. On behalf of the Practice Community PENAC, we invite you to follow our webinar series on adaptation to climate change. As I mentioned before, we will share with all of you the presentations and the recording of this webinar in the following days. Having said that, have a good day. I'll see you later.